The blade came down toward the child's head, and Emmeline threw herself forward without thinking. The steel bit deep into her shoulder, splitting flesh and bone, but the 4-year-old Heir behind her remained untouched. Blood, her blood, splattered across the marble floor of the throne room as the royal decree that had condemned her to servitude 3 years ago seemed suddenly insignificant compared to this moment. The assassin's eyes widened as this rejected Omega, this wolf without a pack, this woman who bore the forbidden bloodline of the Shadowfen outcasts, refused to move even as the second blow came down. Before we continue, tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Emmeline had been 7 years old when her parents were executed under pack law. Their crime: loving across bloodline boundaries that the council had forbidden for 3 centuries. Her mother, an Omega from the disgraced Shadowfen line, and her father, a Beta from the Royal Guard, had dared to believe love could transcend the ancient divisions that kept the kingdom's wolf packs in rigid hierarchy. They were wrong. She watched from a locked tower window as the executioner's blade fell twice, as the crowd cheered, as the Alpha King Theodore himself signed the death warrant without even looking at it. But that was 17 years ago. 17 years of survival in the lowest ranks of the palace, serving as a scullery maid, invisible to everyone except when they needed someone to blame. 17 years of hiding her true scent with stolen herbs and borrowed charms, because if anyone discovered she carried her mother's forbidden Omega essence combined with her father's Beta strength, a combination that should have been impossible, she would face the same blade her parents had. The second sword strike shattered her collarbone. Emmeline screamed, but she didn't move. Behind her, little Bastien, the Alpha King's only son and heir to the throne, whimpered and pressed his small hands against her bleeding back. "Don't let them hurt me," the child whispered. "Please, Emi, don't let them." The assassin raised his blade a 3rd time, but then the throne room doors exploded inward. The Alpha King himself stormed through, his massive wolf form already half emerged, silver for bristling with lethal intent. Theodore Valmont had ruled the 5 kingdoms for 23 years with an iron fist and a cold heart. He had taken his blood oath to protect the royal line above all else, even above his own happiness, even above mercy. He had never remarried after his queen, Bastien's mother, died in childbirth, and rumor said he never would. Love was weakness. Attachment was liability. The throne demanded absolute devotion. But when his golden eyes locked onto Emmeline's broken body covering his son, something changed in that ancient wolf's gaze. The assassin died before he could scream. Theodore's claws tore through the man's throat with surgical precision, and then the king was there, kneeling in Emmeline's blood, his hands, human again, trembling, pulling her away from Bastien with surprising gentleness. "Get the healers," he roared at the guards flooding the room. "Now! And someone secure my son." But Bastien clung to Emmeline's dress, his little face wet with tears. "She saved me, Papa. She saved me when everyone else ran away." Emmeline's vision swam. The pain was extraordinary, radiating from her shoulder and collarbone in waves that made breathing nearly impossible. But through the agony she saw the king's face, really saw it, for the first time in her life. Theodore Valmont was 41 years old, scarred from 100 battles, his dark hair threaded with silver, his jaw perpetually set in harsh lines. He was not a kind man. He was not a gentle man. But as he looked down at her, as his hands carefully supported her neck to keep her from choking on her own blood, something cracked in that frozen expression. "You're the scullery maid," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Emmeline, daughter of the traitors." She tried to speak, but blood filled her mouth. The world tilted sideways. The last thing she heard before consciousness left her was the king's voice, sharp and commanding. "She's mine. Under my protection. Anyone who touches her answers to me with their life." When Emmeline woke, 3 days had passed. She was in a bedroom she didn't recognize, luxurious beyond anything she'd ever experienced, with silk sheets and a fireplace and actual glass windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Her shoulder and collarbone were wrapped in clean bandages that smelled of healing herbs, and the pain had reduced from unbearable to merely excruciating. A woman sat beside her bed, embroidering something with quick, efficient stitches. She looked up when Emmeline stirred. "Finally," the woman said. "The king has been checking on you 6 times a day. Quite unusual for a man who supposedly cares for nothing but duty." She set aside her embroidery. "I'm Seraphine, the head healer. You're very lucky to be alive. Those sword blows should have killed you." Emmeline's voice came out as a rasp. "Bastien. The young heir is perfectly safe thanks to you. He's been asking about you constantly. Won't let anyone else read him his bedtime stories." Seraphine poured water from a crystal pitcher and held it to Emmeline's lips. "You've caused quite the stir, little mouse." The rejected Omega who threw herself in front of an assassin's blade to save the future king. The palace hasn't stopped talking about it. The water helped, but fear tightened Emmeline's chest. "The king said I was under his protection. What does that mean?" Seraphine's expression turned carefully neutral. "It means exactly what it sounds like. You're no longer a servant. You've been moved to the royal wing, given a title. Lady Emmeline of House Valmont, ward of the throne. The council is furious, of course. They're calling it a violation of pack law, claiming that your bloodline makes you unfit for any position of status. But the king invoked his sovereign right to grant protection to anyone who saves a member of the royal family." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Between you and me, I've never seen Theodore fight the council this hard over anything that didn't directly threaten his rule. Whatever his reasons, he's making powerful enemies to keep you safe." Before Emmeline could respond, the door opened. She knew who it was before she saw him. The power radiating from the doorway was unmistakable. Alpha energy, pure and overwhelming. The kind that made every wolf in proximity want to either submit or flee. Theodore Valmont filled the room with his presence, and Seraphine immediately bowed and excused herself. The king approached the bed with slow, measured steps. He was dressed simply today. Leather breeches and a white shirt, his crown notably absent. Up close, without the pageantry of the throne room, he looked tired. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and shadows darkened the skin beneath his eyes. He studied Emmeline for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know why you're still alive?" His voice was rough like gravel shifting. "The council demanded I execute you. They cited 16 different precedents, all of them valid under pack law. Your bloodline is forbidden. Your parents were traitors. By every rule we have, you should have died the moment your heritage was discovered." Emmeline's heart hammered. "Then why didn't you kill me?" "Because my son is alive." Theodore's jaw tightened. "Because you, a woman who had every reason to hate me, to hate this palace, to hate everything the royal family represents, threw yourself in front of a blade meant for him. You took strikes that would have decapitated a child without hesitation. You didn't think. You didn't calculate advantage. You simply acted." He paused, and something that might have been pain flickered across his features. "In 23 years on this throne, I've seen courage of many kinds. But what you did, that was something else." "I love Bastien," Emmeline said quietly. "He's a good child. Kind. He doesn't deserve to die because of political games." "No, he doesn't." The king pulled a chair close to her bedside and sat, which was so unexpected that Emmeline couldn't hide her shock. Kings didn't sit at the bedsides of servants. Even elevated servants. Even wards of the throne. "I need to understand something, Emmeline. Your parents were executed when you were 7. You've lived in this palace as a servant for 17 years, knowing that I signed their death warrant, knowing that I could end your life with a word. Why save my son?" The question was direct, demanding honesty. Emmeline met his golden eyes that had seen countless deaths, eyes that held the weight of kingdoms, and told him the truth. "Because Bastien is innocent. Because punishing a child for the sins of others is the same evil that killed my parents. I won't perpetuate that cycle, not even for revenge." Something shifted in Theodore's expression. For just a moment the hard mask slipped and she saw grief there, Old grief buried deep but never truly forgotten. Your mother's name was Marguerite, he said softly. I remember her. She served in the Queen's household before she married your father. She had a beautiful voice. The Queen loved to hear her sing. Emmeline's breath caught. No one had spoken her mother's name in 17 years. You remember her. I remember all of them. Every execution I've ordered. Every life I've taken in service of the throne. I remember your father too, Luke. He was a good soldier. Loyal. When I signed that death warrant, he stopped looking away. I told myself it was necessary. That pack law existed for good reasons. That allowing forbidden bloodlines would destabilize everything our ancestors built. But lately, I wonder if I've been telling myself comfortable lies to avoid facing what I've become. The vulnerability in his voice was shocking. This was the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the 5 kingdoms, and he was confessing doubt to her. Emmeline didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, just waited. Theodore stood abruptly, the moment of weakness passing. The council meets tomorrow to discuss your fate. They're going to push for your execution or at minimum exile. I won't allow either. You saved my son's life, and I pay my debts. But I need to offer them something. Some compromise that preserves your life while appeasing their concerns about bloodline purity. He turned back to her, and his next words were heavy with implication. There's one option that would silence all objections. It would bind you to the royal family permanently. Make your presence not just acceptable but unassailable under pack law. Emmeline's pulse quickened. What option? I could claim you as my mate. The words hung in the air like a blade about to fall. Emmeline stared at him, certain she'd misheard. That's impossible. You're an Alpha King. I'm a rejected Omega from a forbidden bloodline. Pack law explicitly prohibits. Pack law prohibits many things that I'm beginning to question, Theodore interrupted. But you're right that it's radical. Unprecedented even. The council would have no choice but to accept it. A king's claim on his mate supersedes all other considerations. But it would make you queen. It would elevate your bloodline from forbidden to royal in a single declaration. And it would mean... He hesitated, and for the first time he looked uncertain. It would mean binding yourself to a man you have every reason to despise. Living beside someone who killed your parents. Sharing power with someone who represents everything you've suffered under. Emmeline's mind reeled. This was insane. This was beyond insane. Mate bonds were sacred, permanent, unbreakable. If the Alpha King claimed her, she would be tied to him for life. Politically, socially, and if the bond took hold as it sometimes did between true mates, spiritually. She would become queen, yes, but she would also become the partner of the man who had orphaned her. Why would you do this? She asked. You could choose any woman in the 5 kingdoms. You could form a political alliance with another pack, strengthen your position. Why risk everything for me? Theodore's expression was unreadable. Because when I saw you bleeding on that throne room floor, covering my son with your body, I realized something. I've spent 23 years making cold, calculated decisions for the good of the kingdom. I've sacrificed love, happiness, mercy, all of it on the altar of duty. But what kind of kingdom am I building if the bravest person in it is someone I've spent her entire life oppressing? What does it say about pack law if the woman who embodies the highest ideals of our people is marked as forbidden? He moved closer, and Emmeline saw the intensity burning in his eyes. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to help me change something that's been broken for far too long. Be my queen. Stand beside me. Show the council and the packs and all the wolves who believe in rigid hierarchies that courage and character matter more than bloodline. And in return I'll give you power, real power, to reshape the laws that killed your parents. It was a speech that would have sounded rehearsed coming from anyone else. But Theodore delivered it with raw honesty. His hands clenched at his sides. His whole body tense with emotion he clearly wasn't accustomed to expressing. This wasn't a political maneuver. This was a man at a crossroads, offering a path that terrified him. Emmeline thought about her parents. About 17 years of scrubbing floors and swallowing rage. About little Bastien, who needed someone to protect him from the vipers circling the throne. About all the other forbidden bloodlines still hiding in shadows, still living in fear, still watching their children grow up with targets on their backs. "If I agree," she said slowly, "I need your oath that this isn't symbolic. I need real authority to reform pack law. I need your support when I dismantle the systems that created the division between bloodlines. I need you to stand with me when the council and the old families resist. Can you promise me that?" Theodore knelt beside her bed, which was such a profound gesture that Emmeline's eyes widened. Kings didn't kneel for anyone except during coronations. "I swear it. Blood oath bound by my alpha word. You'll have everything you need to make the changes you see fit. I'll stand with you against anyone who opposes it. Council, nobility, even other alphas if necessary. You saved my son. Now let me help you save your people." His hand extended, palm up, waiting. The traditional gesture of a mate claim. Offered, not forced. Emmeline knew that if she took his hand now, everything would change. There would be no going back. She would become Queen Emmeline, mate to the Alpha King, one of the most powerful women in the realm. She would also be bound to a man whose past actions had caused her immeasurable pain. But she would have the power to ensure no other child watched their parents die for loving someone from the wrong bloodline. Emmeline placed her hand in his. The mate bond snapped into place like a physical force. Emmeline gasped as sensation flooded through her. Not the gentle warmth she'd heard other Omegas describe, but something fierce and overwhelming. She felt Theodore's strength, his barely contained power, the depth of guilt he carried like armor. And underneath all of it, she felt loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. This man had been alone for so long, making impossible choices, bearing impossible burdens, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside him rather than behind him. Theodore's eyes flared golden as the bond took hold on his side. His breath came shorter. "I feel you," he said, wonder in his voice. "Your pain. Your determination. Your fire. I've never felt anything like this." "The bond is strong," Emmeline managed. Her shoulder still hurt, but the pain seemed distant now, overshadowed by the connection thrumming between them. "I thought it would be gentler, easier." Theodore's laugh was rough. "Nothing about either of us is gentle or easy. Why should our bond be different?" He stood, pulling her up with him carefully, mindful of her injuries. "The council meets in 6 hours. We'll announce our mate bond then. They'll try to fight it, but pack law is clear. An alpha's claim is absolute. By sunset you'll be queen. And by sunset, half the nobility will want me dead," Emmeline pointed out. Yes. He didn't sugarcoat it. "The next few months will be dangerous. There will be assassination attempts, political maneuvering, outright rebellion from some of the old families. But you've already proven you're not afraid to face blades meant for others. And now you won't face them alone." The council chamber was exactly as Emmeline remembered from the one time she'd been dragged there as a child. Cavernous, cold, designed to make supplicants feel small. 12 high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle, each occupied by a council member representing one of the major packs. Chancellor Arnaud sat in the center seat, his white beard immaculately groomed, his expression one of barely contained fury. Theodore entered with Emmeline at his side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. She'd been dressed in formal court attire, a deep blue gown that marked her as royal, her hair arranged in the style befitting a queen. The healers had worked overnight to ensure she could stand without visible pain, though her shoulder still throbbed with every heartbeat. The council members rose as the king entered, but their eyes were all on Emmeline. She could read the emotions flickering across their faces: shock, outrage, disgust, calculation. These were the wolves who had upheld pack law for decades, who had grown fat and powerful on the rigid hierarchies that kept certain bloodlines at the bottom. To them, she represented everything they'd spent their lives keeping suppressed. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Arnaud said, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "We were expecting a discussion of security measures following the assassination attempt. We were not expecting this." His gaze raked over Emmeline with unconcealed contempt. "Then let me clarify," Theodore said, his voice carrying the full weight of his alpha authority. 3 days ago, my son's life was saved by this woman. She took blows meant for the heir without hesitation. She bled for the future of this kingdom while guards and nobility fled. I'm here to announce that I've claimed Lady Emmeline as my mate and future queen." The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted. "This is an outrage." Councilman Florent leaped to his feet. "Her bloodline is forbidden. Pack law explicitly prohibits. Pack law explicitly permits an alpha's mate claim to supersede all other considerations." Theodore cut him off coldly. "Or have you forgotten the precedents you've all cited countless times when it suited your purposes? When Alpha Remy claimed his mate from the conquered northern territories, this council approved it despite her being from an enemy bloodline. When Alpha Bernard claimed his mate from the merchant class, you all celebrated the union. But now, when I claim a woman who saved my son's life, suddenly pack law is an insurmountable obstacle." "Those situations were entirely different," Chancellor Arnaud protested. "Those mates came from accepted lineages, even if their status was questionable. But this woman, her parents were executed traitors. Her mother's bloodline has been forbidden for 300 years. Allowing her to become queen would undermine the very foundations of our society." Emmeline felt rage building in her chest. These were the same men who had stood silent while her parents died. The same men who had enforced the laws that had made her childhood a nightmare. She'd promised herself she would be strategic, diplomatic, careful. But standing there, watching them discuss her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person who had nearly died for the heir, something inside her snapped. "Tell me, Chancellor," she said, her voice cutting through the arguing. The council members fell silent, shocked that she dared speak. "What exactly makes my bloodline forbidden? What crime did my ancestors commit that justifies 3 centuries of persecution?" Arnaud's face reddened. "Your ancestors betrayed the kingdom during the Blood Moon Wars. They sided with enemy packs, committed treason." "My ancestors were healers," Emmeline interrupted. "I've read the histories, the real histories, not the propaganda you feed to the public. The Shadowfen line was renowned for healing magic that saved thousands of lives during the wars. But when the wars ended, the surviving alphas wanted to consolidate power. My ancestors refused to use their healing knowledge as a weapon, refused to create plagues and poisons for political gain. So those alphas declared the entire bloodline corrupted and forbidden, ensuring no future generation could challenge their authority with knowledge they couldn't control." The silence was absolute. Councilwoman Genevieve looked uncomfortable. Councilman Remy's expression had turned thoughtful. But Chancellor Arnaud's face was a mask of fury. "How dare you speak such lies in this chamber?" "They're not lies." Theodore's voice was steel. "I've read those same histories. In fact, I ordered the Royal Archives searched the day after Emmeline saved my son. Everything she's saying is documented. The Shadowfen persecution was politically motivated, not based on any actual crime. We've been enforcing a 300-year-old power grab as if it were sacred law." Councilman Florent stood. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that pack law is pack law. We can't simply set aside centuries of tradition because it's suddenly inconvenient." "Can't we?" Theodore moved forward, his alpha presence filling the room until several council members actually stepped back. "I am the Alpha King. I am the embodiment of pack law. And I'm telling you that the law is about to change. Emmeline will be queen. Her bloodline will be restored to full status. And we will begin the process of reviewing every forbidden bloodline designation to determine which ones are based on legitimate concerns and which ones are based on political convenience. This is madness." Chancellor Arnaud's hands shook. Your Majesty, think about what you're doing. The old families will revolt. Other packs will see this as weakness. You'll tear the kingdom apart. The kingdom is already torn, Emmeline said quietly. You've just been ignoring the fractures because they were conveniently hidden beneath the surface. How many forbidden bloodlines are there, Chancellor? How many wolves live in fear, hide their heritage, watch their children grow up as second-class citizens because of crimes their great-great-grandparents supposedly committed? How many more Emmelynes will have to watch their parents die before you admit the system is broken? Councilwoman Genevieve spoke up, her voice measured. The girl makes a point. We've all known that the forbidden bloodline laws were harsh. But we've maintained them because changing them seemed too complicated, too politically dangerous. Perhaps this is an opportunity to address something we've been avoiding for too long. You would side with this outcast over 300 years of precedent? Florent demanded. I would side with common sense over outdated cruelty, Genevieve replied calmly. And I would remind you all that this woman saved the heir's life. If that doesn't earn her consideration, what message are we sending about the values we claim to uphold? The debate raged for another 2 hours. Emmeline stood through all of it, her shoulder screaming in pain but her spine straight, refusing to show weakness. Theodore remained beside her, his hand never leaving her back, a constant reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. Some council members gradually came around to Genevieve's position. Others remained adamantly opposed. But in the end, pack law was clear. An Alpha King's mate claim could not be overruled by the council. Chancellor Arnaud's final words were delivered with cold precision. Very well, Your Majesty. We accept your mate claim under duress and with the strongest possible reservations. But know this, you've made powerful enemies today. The old families won't accept this quietly. And when the rebellion comes, and it will come, remember that you chose this path against all counsel. I'll remember, Theodore said. Now get out. All of you. The Queen and I have much to discuss. The council filed out, leaving them alone in the vast chamber. Emmeline's legs finally gave out, and Theodore caught her, lowering her gently into one of the high-backed chairs. That went well, she said with dark humor. That was a disaster, Theodore replied, but there was something almost like approval in his eyes. You challenged the Chancellor directly. That took courage. That took stupidity. I made an enemy of the most powerful man in your council. You made an enemy who was already your enemy. Arnaud's family has been enforcing the forbidden bloodline laws for 5 generations. He built his entire political career on maintaining those divisions. You were never going to win him over. Theodore crouched in front of her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. But you swayed Genevieve. And possibly Remy. That's 2 votes we didn't have before. In council politics, that's a victory. Emmeline managed a weak smile. I never imagined I'd be learning council politics. You're queen now. Or you will be, once we complete the mating ceremony. You'll need to learn a lot of things very quickly. His expression softened slightly. But right now you need rest. The healers warn me that you pushed yourself too hard today. Let me get you back to your chambers. He lifted her effortlessly, cradling her against his chest as he carried her out of the council chamber. Emmeline was too exhausted to protest. The bond between them pulsed with his concern, his determination, and underneath it all, a growing warmth that might have been affection or might have been something else entirely. Theodore, she said as they walked through the palace corridors, guards falling into step behind them. What happens if this doesn't work? What happens if we can't change enough minds? If the rebellion Arnaud warned about actually happens? Then we fight, he said simply. Together. That's what mates do. The mating ceremony took place 3 days later in the palace's ancient chapel. It was a small affair by royal standards. Just the immediate household, a handful of trusted advisors, and little Bastien, who stood as witness with a serious expression that made him look much older than 4. The priest conducting the ceremony was visibly uncomfortable binding a king to a woman from a forbidden bloodline, but he didn't dare refuse. Emmeline wore white, traditional for an Omega claiming a mate, though the gown had been modified to accommodate her still healing shoulder. Theodore wore his crown and formal robes, looking every inch the powerful Alpha King. But when he took her hands in his, speaking the ancient vows that would bind them for life, his voice was gentle. I, Theodore Valmont, Alpha King of the Five Kingdoms, claim you as my mate before moon and stars, before pack and throne. I swear to protect you, to stand with you, to share my strength when yours falters. I bind my life to yours, my fate to yours, until the last breath leaves my body. Emmeline's hands trembled as she replied, I, Emmeline of House Shadowfen, accept your claim. I swear to stand beside you, to share your burdens, to offer my strength when yours falters. I bind my life to yours, my fate to yours, until the last breath leaves my body. The priest bound their hands with a silver cord, speaking the final blessing. When he stepped back, the mate bond that had been forming since that moment in Emmeline's sick room suddenly completed itself. The sensation was overwhelming, not painful, but so intense that Emmeline gasped. She felt Theodore's presence in her mind, not as thoughts but as pure emotion. His determination, his guilt, his fierce protectiveness. And underneath it all, a longing so deep it made her want to weep. Theodore kissed her, and the bond flared brighter. The small audience applauded, but Emmeline barely heard them. All she could feel was this connection, this impossible link to a man who had been her enemy and was now something else entirely. You're mine now, Theodore murmured against her lips. And I'm yours. No council, no law, no political maneuvering can break what we've just forged. But even as he spoke, Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. The mate bond let her sense things about him that he tried to hide, including the fear he wouldn't voice. He believed they were in danger, serious danger, and soon. The first assassination attempt came that very night. Emmeline woke to the sound of breaking glass. She rolled out of bed, the massive royal bed she now shared with Theodore, though they'd spent the night on opposite sides, neither quite ready to consummate a bond forged from necessity rather than love. The king was already moving. His wolf form halfway emerged, golden eyes blazing in the darkness. Stay behind me, he growled. But Emmeline had spent 17 years surviving in the shadows. She grabbed a silver candlestick from the nightstand, heavy, solid, a decent weapon in a pinch, and positioned herself so that she could see both the window and the door. 3 figures in black dropped through the shattered window. Assassins, trained and deadly, their movements coordinated. The fight was brutal and swift. Theodore's claws tore through 2 of the attackers with vicious efficiency, but the third got past him, heading straight for Emmeline. She swung the candlestick with all her strength, catching the assassin across the temple. The man went down hard, but not before his knife sliced across her forearm. Blood welled up, hot and immediate. More guards burst through the door, securing the room. Theodore was at Emmeline's side instantly, his hands examining her arm with surprising gentleness for someone still half-shifted. You're hurt. I'm alive. She looked at the unconscious assassin. We need him questioned. Find out who sent them. The interrogation took 3 hours, and methods Emmeline preferred not to think about too closely. But by dawn they had their answer. The assassination had been ordered by a coalition of old family nobles, led by Chancellor Arnaud's nephew. The message was clear. The old guard would not accept a queen from a forbidden bloodline without a fight. We need to arrest them, Emmeline said as she sat in the strategy room, her arm freshly bandaged. Around her, the king's closest advisors argued about next steps. Every single noble involved in this plot. Make an example that attempts on the queen's life will be punished with the full force of the throne. That would mean arresting 1/3 of the nobility, General Mathieu protested. The political fallout. The political fallout of not responding is worse, Emmeline interrupted. If we show weakness now, if we negotiate or compromise, we're telling every enemy we have that assassination is a viable strategy. We're telling them that I'm not really queen, that my life is worth less than political convenience. Theodore, who had been silent through most of the meeting, suddenly stood. The Queen is right. Issue arrest warrants for everyone implicated. Seize their properties. And send a message to every pack in the 5 kingdoms. Any attack on Queen Emmeline is an attack on the throne itself, and will be met with absolute retaliation. The arrests began that afternoon. Nobles screamed about injustice as guards dragged them from their estates. Chancellor Arnaud's nephew tried to run and was caught at the border. The old families flooded the palace with protests, but Theodore met each one with the same cold response. You tried to murder my mate. Be grateful you're facing a cell instead of an executioner's blade. But the unrest was spreading. In the streets of the capital, people argued about the new queen. Some celebrated her. A woman who had risen from nothing to the highest position in the land, who had literally bled to save the heir. Others condemned her as an abomination, a forbidden bloodline that would bring curses upon the kingdom. Fights broke out. Protests turned into riots. The city watch worked overtime trying to maintain order. Emmeline watched from the palace balcony as her coronation procession wound through streets lined with both cheering supporters and angry protesters. Theodore stood beside her, his hand clasped firmly in hers. His presence a constant reassurance through the mate bond. But she could feel his worry. This was exactly the instability he'd feared. Maybe we moved too fast, she said quietly. Maybe we should have waited, built more support before. No. His voice was firm. The moment I claimed you, this became inevitable. The old families would have fought us no matter when we moved. At least this way we control the timing. We choose the battlefield. And if we lose, then we lose together. He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his golden eyes stole her breath. But I don't intend to lose. Neither should you. You're not just a symbol, Emmeline. You're genuinely brilliant. You've survived 17 years in circumstances that would have broken most people. You faced down the council without flinching. You're exactly the queen this kingdom needs, even if they don't know it yet. The coronation itself was a tense affair. The crown, delicate silver worked with moonstone, ancient and powerful, was placed on Emmeline's head by the high priestess with visible reluctance. The noble families in attendance ranged from genuinely supportive to openly hostile. Several seats remained conspicuously empty, occupied by those who had been arrested or had fled rather than attend. When the high priestess spoke the final blessing and declared Emmeline to be queen of the 5 kingdoms, the applause was scattered and uncertain. But little Bastien started cheering, loud, enthusiastic, childish cheering that echoed through the vast cathedral. And then others joined. The common folk who had been allowed to witness the ceremony from the back rows, the servants, the guards, the people who understood what it meant to see someone rise from nothing, the people who had themselves been invisible. Emmeline's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. Not here. Not in front of these nobles who were watching for any sign of weakness. Instead, she lifted her chin and met their stares with calm dignity. She was queen now. She had power, and she intended to use every bit of it. The celebration feast that followed was poisonous in more ways than one. Literally poisonous, as it turned out. Emmeline had just raised her wine goblet for the traditional toast when Theodore's hand shot out, knocking the cup from her grasp. It shattered on the marble floor, dark wine spreading like blood. "Don't drink," he commanded, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. He turned to the cupbearer, a young man who had served the royal family for years. "Who gave you that wine?" The cupbearer's face went white. It came from the royal cellars, Your Majesty." Same as always. "I didn't." "Guards, secure him." Theodore's eyes blazed with fury. "And bring me the head steward. Now." The investigation revealed nightshade in the wine, not enough to kill instantly, but enough to cause a slow, agonizing death over several days. The cupbearer was innocent, a pawn. But the head steward, when questioned, broke down and confessed. He'd been paid by Lady Clotilde, a noblewoman whose family had enforced the forbidden bloodline laws for 6 generations. She'd fled the city the moment the coronation ended, but guards were already in pursuit. "They're not going to stop," Emmeline said later that night, alone with Theodore in their chambers. Her crown sat on the vanity, suddenly feeling heavier than it had during the ceremony. "Every day there's another attempt, another plot. How long can we keep this up?" Theodore was standing by the window, looking out over the city. Torches flickered in the darkness where riots were still being suppressed. "As long as it takes. Change is never easy, Emmeline. The forbidden bloodline laws have been in place for 300 years. We're not going to dismantle them in 3 weeks without resistance. But maybe we're pushing too hard too fast. Maybe if we what?" He turned to face her, and the mate bond flared with his intensity. "Slow down. Compromise. Show them that their tantrums and assassination attempts work. Every time we hesitate, every time we pull back, we tell them that you're not really queen. That the forbidden bloodlines aren't really equal. That the old ways can be preserved if they just fight hard enough." "People are dying," Emmeline said quietly. "There were 3 killed in the riots today. 5 more injured. All because we're forcing change they're not ready for. And how many have died over the past 300 years because of the forbidden bloodline laws?" Theodore crossed to her, taking her hands. "How many children grew up as you did, watching their parents executed for loving the wrong person? How many talented wolves were kept from positions they deserved because of ancestors they never knew? We're not causing this violence, Emmeline. We're exposing violence that's been happening in the shadows for centuries." He was right. She knew he was right. But that didn't make it easier to watch. The weeks that followed were a blur of political maneuvering and constant danger. Emmeline threw herself into the work of reform, drafting new laws with a team of progressive advisors. She met with representatives from other forbidden bloodlines, hearing their stories, documenting the injustices they'd faced. She appeared publicly as often as possible, refusing to hide despite the threats, showing the kingdom that their queen would not be intimidated. And slowly, gradually, things began to shift. Not everywhere, not even in most places. But in small pockets throughout the 5 kingdoms, people started to listen. A merchant in the eastern provinces hired a woman from a forbidden bloodline as his business partner, citing the queen's example. A minor noble in the south announced her engagement to a man whose family had been outcast for generations, daring anyone to challenge her under the new precedents the queen was establishing. But for every small victory, there were setbacks. Lord Philippe, one of the council members who had seemed sympathetic, was found dead in his study, an apparent suicide, though the letter he left suggested he'd been blackmailed by the old families for supporting the queen's reforms. A village in the north burned to the ground after its elder welcomed forbidden bloodline refugees, though whether it was an accident or arson remained unclear. Theodore grew harder with each incident, his responses more severe. When evidence linked a group of nobles to the village burning, he had them executed without trial, citing wartime emergency powers. Emmeline knew it was necessary. These were acts of terrorism, deliberate attempts to destabilize the kingdom, but she watched her mate becoming the cold, ruthless king she'd heard stories about, and it frightened her. "You're losing yourself," she told him one night after he'd ordered another round of arrests. "This isn't justice. This is revenge. This is survival," he countered. "They're trying to start a civil war, Emmeline. If I show mercy, if I hesitate, more innocents will die. I won't let that happen. But where does it end? How many executions before we become exactly what we're fighting against?" The argument escalated, both of them too stressed and exhausted to moderate their words. It ended with Theodore storming out of their chambers and Emmeline crying alone for the first time since her coronation. The mate bond ached with their discord, a physical pain in her chest that wouldn't ease until he returned hours later. His anger burned out, replaced by exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said, kneeling beside the bed where she still sat. "You're right. I'm letting this consume me. I'm becoming the man I swore I wouldn't be. No, I'm sorry." Emmeline cupped his face in her hands. You're trying to protect the kingdom, protect me. I know the decisions you're making aren't easy. I don't want this to destroy you. Destroy us. Us. He repeated the word like it was precious. 6 weeks ago there was no us. There was a king and a servant who saved his son. Now there's a mate bond, a queen, a partnership. When did that happen? Gradually. Then suddenly. Emmeline smiled despite her tears. I didn't expect to care about you, Theodore. I certainly didn't expect to love you. But somewhere between the council chambers and the assassination attempts and the late-night strategy sessions, you became the person I can't imagine facing any of this without. His eyes widened. You love me. I think I do. Which is terrifying and probably foolish and definitely complicated given that you signed my parents' death warrant, but yes. I love you. Theodore kissed her then. Not the formal kiss from their mating ceremony, but something deeper, rawer, desperate. The mate bond sang between them, amplifying every sensation until Emmeline couldn't tell where she ended and he began. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. I don't deserve you, he whispered. But I love you too. So much that it terrifies me. 'Cause now I have something to lose. Now the threats against you aren't just political problems to be solved. They're personal attacks on the person who's become the center of my world. They made love that night for the first time since their mating ceremony. And it was nothing like the cold political union they'd both expected. It was passion and tenderness and desperate need. Two people clinging to each other in the middle of a storm. Afterward, lying tangled in silk sheets with her head on his chest, Emmeline felt the mate bond settle into something solid and unshakable. Whatever happens, she said, we face it together. Together, Theodore agreed. Always. But fate had other plans. The next morning, Emmeline woke to find Theodore already gone. Unusual, since he typically waited for her to wake. A note on his pillow explained he'd been called to an emergency council session. She dressed quickly and headed for the council chambers, but guards stopped her at the door. The council is in closed session, Your Majesty. The king ordered that no one be admitted until they've reached a decision. Emmeline's instincts screamed warning. A decision about what? The guard looked uncomfortable. I don't know the details, Your Majesty. But messengers arrived from all 5 kingdoms overnight. It's serious. She paced outside the chambers for 2 hours, the mate bond giving her vague impressions of Theodore's emotional state. Anger, frustration, and something that felt like despair. When the doors finally opened, the king emerged looking 10 years older. His eyes found hers across the hall, and the sorrow in them made her breath catch. What happened? We need to talk. Privately. He took her arm, guiding her to a small antechamber away from curious ears. Once the door closed, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I'm so sorry, Emmeline. I'm so sorry. Theodore, you're scaring me. What's going on? He pulled back, keeping his hands on her shoulders. The other 4 kingdoms are threatening war. Their alphas sent joint letters to the council overnight. They're calling your coronation an abomination, a violation of ancient treaties that govern how the kingdoms maintain the bloodline laws. They're giving me 30 days to annul our mating and return to traditional pack law, or they'll consider it an act of aggression against the established order. Emmeline's world tilted. They can't do that. Mate bonds can't be annulled. It's impossible. Nothing is impossible if the alternative is civil war across all 5 kingdoms. His voice broke. The council is divided. Half want to resist, consequences be damned. The other half are terrified. They're pointing out that we're not prepared for a multi-front war. That our allies are few and our enemies are many. That this entire crisis could have been avoided if I just followed tradition and chosen a mate from an acceptable bloodline. So what are you saying? Emmeline's voice was barely a whisper. Are you saying you want to annul the bond? No. The word exploded from him. Gods no. Never. But Emmeline, if we refuse, thousands will die. Maybe tens of thousands. The other kingdoms will invade. And we'll be fighting a war on 4 fronts simultaneously. And even if we somehow win, the kingdom will be devastated. Everything we've been trying to build, all the reforms, all the progress, will be destroyed in the conflict." She understood what he was really saying. They had a choice. Their love or the lives of countless innocents. Their bond or the stability of the realm. Each other or everything they'd been fighting for. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Some compromise, some negotiation. I've been searching for one all morning. So has the council. There's nothing. The other alphas have made their position clear. They see what we're doing as a threat to the entire system they've built their power on. They're not interested in compromise. They want capitulation or war." Emmeline felt tears streaming down her face. Through the mate bond, she felt Theodore's anguish matching her own. This was impossible. They couldn't break a mate bond. The magical and spiritual connection that tied them together was permanent, unbreakable by any known means. But they could reject each other publicly, could live separate lives, could pretend the bond didn't exist. It wouldn't end their connection, but it would satisfy the political demands. It would also destroy them both. "How long do we have?" she asked. 30 days. After that, the other kingdoms mobilize for war. Then we use every one of those 30 days. Emmeline straightened, wiping away her tears with angry swipes. "We search for alternatives. We reach out to potential allies. We prepare for war if it comes. And we don't give up on each other until every other option is exhausted." "Emmeline! No. Listen to me." She grabbed his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You told me that mate bonds are sacred. That when you claimed me, nothing could break what we forged. Were those just pretty words, or did you mean them?" "I meant them," he said fiercely. "With everything I am. Then we fight. Not against each other but for each other. We find a way through this that doesn't require either of us to sacrifice what we've built. Because I'm not just your mate, Theodore. I'm your queen. And queens don't surrender." A spark of hope flickered in his eyes. "Even when the odds are impossible. Especially then." The next 30 days were the most intense of Emmeline's life. She threw herself into diplomacy with a ferocity that surprised even her closest advisors. She sent letters to every alpha in the 5 kingdoms. Not just the ones making threats, but their advisors, their families, their council members. She reached out to forbidden bloodlines in other kingdoms, building a network of support that crossed traditional boundaries. She met with merchants, craftsmen, common soldiers, anyone who might have influence, anyone who might help sway opinion. Theodore focused on military preparations. If war came, they would be ready. He called up reserves, fortified border positions, reached out to mercenary companies and independent warrior packs. But he also sent his own diplomatic missions, looking for cracks in the united front the other kingdoms presented. And slowly, cracks began to appear. Alpha Remy of the Eastern Kingdom had a daughter from a forbidden bloodline. Hidden, but not well enough that Emmeline's new network couldn't find her. When confronted with the hypocrisy of threatening war over the very thing he himself had engaged in, Remy withdrew his kingdom's support for the ultimatum. In the Southern Kingdom, Emmeline's reforms had inspired a grassroots movement among the forbidden bloodlines. They staged peaceful protests, disrupted commerce, made it clear that war in the name of preserving their oppression would face massive internal resistance. The Southern Alpha, pragmatic above all else, recalculated the cost-benefit analysis and backed down. 2 kingdoms down. 2 to go. The Northern Alpha was old, traditional, immovable in his convictions. But his heir, a young Alpha named Gaston, had been educated in progressive circles and had secretly written to Emmeline expressing support for her reforms. Emmeline arranged a private meeting, traveling in secret to the border territory where they could talk without the old Alpha's knowledge. "My father will never accept what you're doing," Gaston said as they walked through a moonlit forest, guards watching from a discreet distance. "He's too set in his ways. But he's also dying. The healers give him 6 months, maybe less. When I inherit, I can withdraw the Northern Kingdom's support for this war. I can even become an ally to your reforms. 6 months is too long, Emmeline replied. We have 3 weeks left on the ultimatum. Then you need to survive those 3 weeks. Go to ground. Disappear. Make it impossible for the Western Kingdom to justify an invasion when there's no clear target. He stopped, turning to face her fully. I'm risking everything telling you this. My father would have me executed for treason if he knew. But I believe in what you're doing, Queen Emmeline. I believe the forbidden bloodline laws are wrong. And I believe you and King Theodore represent something the 5 kingdoms desperately need. Change. If I disappear, it looks like we're backing down. It undermines everything we've fought for. If you die in a war you can't win, it ends everything you've fought for permanently. Gaston's expression was earnest. Sometimes the brave thing isn't standing and fighting. Sometimes it's living to fight another day. Emmeline returned to the capital with much to think about. She discussed Gaston's proposal with Theodore late into the night, weighing their options. The Western Kingdom, ruled by the ruthless Alpha Dominique, remained their biggest threat. Dominique had been the one to organize the other Alphas, the driving force behind the ultimatum. He saw the forbidden bloodline reforms as an existential threat to his power, and he wouldn't back down easily. We could try to assassinate him, one of Theodore's generals suggested during a strategy meeting. Without Dominique, the Western Kingdom's position collapses. No. Emmeline's voice was sharp. We're not becoming murderers. That makes us no better than the people who've tried to kill me a dozen times over. Then what do you suggest? The general asked, not unkindly. We're running out of time and options. What Emmeline suggested was radical, dangerous, and possibly insane. She would go to the Western Kingdom herself. Not in secret but openly as queen. She would request a formal audience with Alpha Dominique and make her case directly. She would bring with her representatives from every forbidden bloodline in the 5 kingdoms, living proof that the people he wanted to keep oppressed were real, human, deserving of dignity. He'll kill you the moment you enter his territory, Theodore said flatly. This is suicide. Maybe. Or maybe he'll be so surprised by the audacity that he'll actually listen. Emmeline took his hands. We've tried everything else. Diplomacy, threats, military posturing. None of it has moved him. But going there in person, putting a face to the reforms he's fighting, showing him the actual people affected by these laws. It might work. And if it doesn't, if he executes you as a traitor to pack law, then you'll have your justification for war. The other kingdoms will have to support you if an alpha murders a queen during a diplomatic mission. Dominique's not stupid. He'll understand the optics. Theodore was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. Through the mate bond, Emmeline felt his terror, his desperation, his pride. Finally he spoke. I'm coming with you. No. The kingdom needs you here, ready to respond if things go wrong. And Bastien needs you. If we both die, he's an orphan. He has regents. He has the council. He has a father who loves him. Don't take that away from him, Theodore. Not for me. In the end, Theodore agreed, though every fiber of his being rebelled against it. Emmeline would take a delegation to the Western Kingdom with a full military escort. Enough to show strength but not so many that it looked like an invasion. She had 7 days to make the journey and plead her case before the ultimatum expired. The night before she left, Theodore held her like he might never let go. If anything happens to you, he whispered against her hair, I will burn the Western Kingdom to the ground. Alpha Dominique, his family, his council, none of them will survive my vengeance. Don't talk like that. I'm coming back. Promise me. I promise. I'm coming back to you, to Bastien, to everything we've built. I'm not letting some ancient alpha with outdated ideas end our story. They made love with desperate intensity, the mate bond blazing bright between them. Afterward, Theodore presented her with a gift, a blade beautifully crafted, with the royal seal etched into the pommel. My queen carries a sword, he said. Because you're not just a diplomat. You're a warrior. You've proven that a dozen times over. So if Dominique tries anything, you fight. You survive. And you come home to me." Emmeline strapped the sword to her hip, feeling its weight settle comfortably against her side. "I will." The journey to the Western Kingdom took 6 days of hard riding. Emmeline's delegation numbered 50 wolves, 30 guards, 15 representatives from forbidden bloodlines, and 5 diplomatic advisors. They traveled under a banner of peace, announcing their intentions at every border crossing, making no secret of their mission. Alpha Dominique's response arrived on the 3rd day. He would grant them an audience, but only Emmeline could enter his throne room. The rest would wait outside under guard. It was a power play, an attempt to intimidate, but Emmeline had expected nothing less. When they finally reached the Western Kingdom's capital, the differences from her own kingdom were immediately apparent. The city was older, more rigid in its structure. Forbidden bloodlines weren't just oppressed here. They were completely absent from public life, hidden so thoroughly that they might as well not exist. The wolves who watched Emmeline's procession with hostile eyes had never questioned the system they lived under, because they'd never seen an alternative. The Western Palace was a fortress, all stone and iron, built for defense rather than beauty. Alpha Dominique's throne room was similarly austere, with none of the elegant decorations that graced Theodore's court. And the Alpha himself, when Emmeline was finally escorted before him, was exactly what she'd expected. A massive wolf in his late 50s, battle-scarred and radiating barely contained aggression. "So," Dominique said, his voice like grinding stone, "the forbidden bloodline queen comes to plead for her life. How the mighty have fallen." Emmeline stood straight, refusing to bow more than protocol demanded. "I come to discuss peace, Alpha Dominique. To find a solution that doesn't require thousands of deaths. The solution is simple. Annul your illegal mating to Theodore. Return to whatever gutter you crawled from. Let the 5 kingdoms restore proper order. My mating is not illegal. It was performed under Pack law, witnessed by the High Priestess, accepted by the Council. You have no authority to demand its annulment. I have the authority of 3 centuries of tradition." Dominique's fist slammed on the arm of his throne. "Your very existence violates every principle our ancestors established. The bloodline laws exist for a reason. To prevent chaos, to maintain stability, to ensure that power remains in the hands of those fit to wield it." "The bloodline laws exist to maintain your power," Emmeline corrected. "To keep certain families at the top and everyone else beneath them. But that system is crumbling, Alpha Dominique. In my kingdom, forbidden bloodlines are already being integrated. Businesses owned by outcasts are thriving. Soldiers from forbidden families serve in the royal guard. The sky hasn't fallen. Chaos hasn't erupted. In fact, we're stronger because we're finally using all our people's talents instead of wasting them." "You're stronger." Dominique laughed, harsh and mocking. "You're on the brink of civil war. Your nobility is divided. Your capital has riots every other week. And now you come begging me to save you from the consequences of your own foolishness." "I'm not begging." Emmeline met his eyes steadily. "I'm offering you a choice. Stand with the old ways and watch the world change without you, or embrace reform and help shape what comes next. Because change is coming, Alpha Dominique. Whether you like it or not. The question is whether you'll be remembered as the leader who resisted progress at all costs, or the one who was wise enough to adapt." For a long moment, Dominique just stared at her. Then he stood, descending from his throne with predatory grace. He circled her slowly, evaluating, and Emmeline forced herself to remain still even as every instinct screamed at her to reach for her sword. "You have courage," he finally admitted. "I'll give you that. Coming here knowing I could end you with a word. That takes either bravery or stupidity. I haven't decided which." He stopped directly in front of her. "But courage alone won't save you. The bloodline laws have kept the 5 kingdoms stable for 300 years. Your reforms threaten that stability. And I will not allow one idealistic girl playing queen to undo centuries of careful order." Then you leave me no choice. Emmeline's hand moved to her sword hilt. I challenge you. Single combat. If I win, you withdraw your support for the ultimatum and allow the reforms to proceed. If you win, I'll accept exile and the dissolution of my political authority. The throne room went deathly silent. Dominique's eyes widened with genuine surprise. You can't be serious. I'm an alpha with 50 years of combat experience. You're a barely trained Omega who's been queen for 2 months. I'll kill you in under a minute. Maybe. But at least I'll die fighting for what I believe in, rather than hiding behind threats and ultimatums. Emmeline drew her sword, Theodore's gift, gleaming silver in the torchlight. What do you say, Alpha Dominique? Are you brave enough to face me yourself, or do you need your armies to do your fighting for you? It was a calculated insult, designed to provoke exactly the response she needed. Dominique's face flushed with rage, his wolf rising to the surface. You dare. I dare. I've dared from the moment I stood between an assassin's blade and a 4-year-old child. I've dared every time I survived another attempt on my life. I've dared by loving a man I should have hated, by taking a throne I was never supposed to reach, by believing that courage and character matter more than bloodline. She raised her sword in formal challenge position. So yes, Alpha Dominique. Dare. The question is whether you do. Dominique's laugh was low and dangerous. You want single combat. Fine. We'll settle this the old way. But know this, girl, when I kill you, your mate will have no choice but to accept the terms of the ultimatum. Your death will accomplish nothing. We'll see. They fought in the palace courtyard, surrounded by Dominique's wolves and Emmeline's small delegation. The Alpha was as dangerous as advertised, faster than his age suggested, stronger than seemed possible, with centuries of battlefield instinct guiding every move. Emmeline was outmatched from the first exchange of blows. But she'd spent 17 years surviving in a palace that wanted her dead. She knew how to fight dirty. When Dominique pressed his advantage, expecting her to retreat, Emmeline instead threw herself forward into the attack, accepting a slice across her ribs to get inside his guard and drive her blade toward his throat. He barely deflected in time, and for the first time uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The fight raged for long, brutal minutes. Emmeline took hit after hit, a gash on her thigh, a deep cut across her shoulder, blood flowing freely from a dozen wounds. But she kept moving, kept attacking, refusing to fall even when she should have. The mate bond sang in her chest, carrying Theodore's strength even across the distance separating them. She wasn't alone. She would never be alone again. Dominique was tiring. For all his experience he was older, and the pace Emmeline was setting, reckless, aggressive, unsustainable, was wearing him down. His next strike came a fraction slower. His defense had a gap. Emmeline took it. Her blade sliced across his chest, drawing blood. Not a killing blow, but a definitive strike that proved she could have killed him if she'd chosen. She stepped back, breathing hard, blood dripping from her many wounds, and raised her sword in a gesture of completion. Do you yield, Alpha Dominique? The courtyard was silent except for their heavy breathing. Dominique looked down at the blood on his chest, then up at Emmeline with new respect in his eyes. How? He demanded. You should be dead 3 times over. I should have been dead at 7 years old. I should have died when the assassin's blade came down in the throne room. I should have died in a dozen other attempts on my life. But I keep surviving, Alpha Dominique. Because I have something to fight for that's bigger than myself. She lowered her sword. Now, do you yield? Long pause. Then, incredibly, Dominique laughed. Genuine amusement instead of mockery. You're either the bravest wolf I've ever met or the most insane. Probably both. He sheathed his own weapon. I yield. You've earned that much. Relief flooded through Emmeline, so intense she nearly collapsed. But she kept her feet, kept her spine straight, as Dominique continued. I'll withdraw the Western Kingdom's support for the ultimatum. But understand this, I'm not doing it because I agree with your reforms. I'm doing it because you've proven you're willing to bleed for them. That kind of conviction deserves respect, even when I think you're wrong. I'll take it, Emmeline said. As she was escorted to healers, as her wounds were treated and bandaged, as diplomatic documents were drawn up formalizing Dominique's withdrawal, Emmeline felt the mate bond pulse with triumph and relief. Theodore knew. Across the distance, he felt her victory, her pain, her survival. And she felt his overwhelming love in return. The journey home took 7 days, longer than planned because Emmeline needed time to heal. But when the capital finally came into view, when she saw Theodore waiting at the gates with Bastien in his arms, the pain didn't matter anymore. She dismounted and ran despite her injuries, and Theodore met her halfway, crushing her against him while Bastien squeezed between them, all three of them holding each other like they'd never let go. You came back, Theodore whispered against her hair. You promised and you came back. Always, Emmeline replied. Always. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of reform. With the external threats neutralized, Emmeline threw herself into the work she'd been preparing for since her coronation. New laws were drafted, erasing the forbidden bloodline designations one by one. Reparations were established for families who had been persecuted. Educational programs were created to help previously outcast wolves integrate into society. It wasn't perfect. There was still resistance, still prejudice, still those who longed for the old ways. But change was happening, real and permanent, and Emmeline could see it in the faces of the wolves who had lived their whole lives in fear and now walked freely through the capital. One afternoon, 6 months after her return from the Western Kingdom, Emmeline stood on the palace balcony watching the city below. Theodore joined her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. What are you thinking about? He asked. Everything. How far we've come. How far we still have to go. She leaned back against him. I was thinking about my parents, wishing they could see this, wishing they knew their deaths weren't meaningless, that something good came from that terrible loss. They'd be proud of you, Theodore said quietly. I never met them, but I know they would be. You've taken the pain they caused and transformed it into something beautiful. That's... He paused, emotion thick in his voice. That's extraordinary. Emmeline turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face. We did it together. You gave me the platform. You stood beside me when everyone else said it was impossible. You're just as responsible for these changes as I am. No. I'm just a man who was lucky enough to be saved by someone far braver and better than he deserved. He kissed her softly. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. Movement at the balcony doors made them turn. Bastien stood there, now 5 years old and growing into a thoughtful, kind child who adored his stepmother. Papa, Amy, can we go to the gardens? I want to show you the flowers I planted. Of course, Emmeline said, taking his hand. Lead the way, little prince. As they walked together, the Alpha King, the queen from a forbidden bloodline, and the heir who represented their future, Emmeline thought about how impossible this all would have seemed a year ago. How much had changed. How much they'd all changed. But the change wasn't over. That night, as she and Theodore prepared for bed, Emmeline shared news she'd been holding close for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I'm pregnant. Theodore froze, his shirt half removed. What? Pregnant? The healer confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a child. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with such joy that she laughed. A child. A child. An heir with both royal blood and forbidden bloodline heritage. The living proof that everything we've fought for can work. Or a target for everyone who still opposes the reforms, Emmeline pointed out. This child will face challenges we can't even imagine yet. Then we'll face them together. All of us. As a family. Theodore's hand moved to her stomach, resting there with gentle reverence. This child will grow up in a kingdom where bloodline doesn't determine worth. Where love across boundaries isn't treason. Where courage matters more than pedigree. We've given them that gift. Not just us. Everyone who fought for change. Everyone who risked their lives and positions and safety to make this possible. Emmeline covered his hand with hers. But we still have so much work ahead. She was right. The pregnancy became public knowledge within weeks, and with it came a fresh wave of controversy. Some celebrated a royal heir born of the new unity they'd fought for. Others called it an abomination, prophesied doom, spread rumors that the child would be cursed or deformed because of its mixed heritage. The council reconvened multiple times to debate the succession implications. If this child, their child, was born healthy and whole, it would shatter the last remaining arguments about forbidden bloodlines producing weak or corrupted offspring. It would be undeniable proof that love across bloodline boundaries created strength, not weakness. Emmeline's pregnancy was difficult. She suffered terrible morning sickness for the first 3 months, so severe that she could barely keep food down. Theodore hovered constantly, driving her half mad with his protectiveness while also being impossibly tender. He brought her favorite foods at odd hours, held her hair when she was sick, read to her when she couldn't sleep. "You're going to be an insufferable father," she told him one night as he fussed over her pillows for the 3rd time. "I'm going to be the father who doesn't lose his mate or his child to complications that could have been prevented with proper care," he countered. "So yes, I'll be insufferable if that's what it takes." But despite his vigilance, trouble found them anyway. When Emmeline was 5 months pregnant, showing clearly and no longer able to hide the evidence of their coming child, another assassination attempt struck. This time the target wasn't just her. It was specifically aimed at ending the pregnancy. The poison was subtle, slipped into her tea by a servant who had been bribed by distant relatives of Chancellor Arnaud. It wasn't meant to kill Emmeline, that would have been too obvious, but to cause a miscarriage that would look natural. The healers caught it in time, but barely. Emmeline spent 3 days hovering between life and death while Theodore raged and grieved in equal measure. When she finally woke, weak but alive, the first thing she felt was panic. The baby. Still there. Still fighting. Just like their mother. Theodore's voice was hoarse from hours of shouting orders and praying to gods he'd long since stopped believing in. "The healers say you both should have died. They don't understand how you survived." "Stubbornness," Emmeline managed with a weak smile. "And the mate bond. I felt you, pulling me back every time I started to slip away." The servant who had poisoned her was executed within the hour. Arnaud's relatives were arrested, their properties seized, their titles stripped. Theodore's fury was apocalyptic. He gave a speech to the assembled court that made grown wolves tremble, declaring that any further attempts on his mate or unborn child would result not just in the death of the perpetrator but the complete destruction of their entire family line. "You can't make threats like that," Emmeline said when they were alone again. "That's collective punishment. That's the kind of tyranny we're trying to end." "I don't care." His voice was raw. "I almost lost you. I almost lost our child. I will burn this entire kingdom to ashes before I let that happen again." "No, you won't. 'Cause that's not who you are. That's not who we are." She took his hand, pressing it to her belly where their child grew. "Feel that. That little flutter. That's our baby, alive and strong because we chose love over hate. Because we chose reform over revenge. We can't betray that now." It took days for Theodore's rage to cool enough for reason to return. But eventually, with Emmeline's guidance and the counsel of their most trusted advisors, he walked back the collective punishment threat while still making it clear that the consequences for harming the queen would be severe and personal. The pregnancy continued. Emmeline grew round with their child, her body changing in ways that were both miraculous and uncomfortable. She had to modify her court appearances, sitting rather than standing for long periods. She couldn't fight anymore, much to her frustration, which meant Theodore insisted on doubling her guard detail. But she continued working. New legislation passed almost monthly now. The educational reforms were showing results. Children from forbidden bloodlines were excelling in the newly opened academies, proving their talents had merely been suppressed, not absent. The economic benefits of integrating previously outcast workers were becoming undeniable, with productivity increasing across multiple industries. Still, resistance simmered. Lord Matthias, a wealthy landowner from the old nobility, began organizing what he called a preservation movement, wolves who believed the reforms were destroying traditional pack culture. They held rallies, distributed pamphlets, and generally made nuisances of themselves. But they stayed within legal bounds, so Emmeline couldn't suppress them without becoming the tyrant her enemies claimed she was. "Let them talk," she told Theodore. "Let them organize and protest and voice their objections. That's the difference between us and the old system. We don't silence dissent. We answer it with better arguments and better results." Theodore disagreed, seeing danger in allowing opposition to organize openly. But he respected Emmeline's judgment enough to let her strategy play out. And remarkably, it worked. As months passed and the kingdom didn't collapse into chaos, as the promised disasters failed to materialize, the preservation movement gradually lost momentum. People were seeing with their own eyes that the reforms led to prosperity, not ruin. Emmeline was 8 months pregnant when the Northern Alpha's death was announced. True to his prediction, the old wolf had lasted 6 months after her visit. Just barely. His son Gaston immediately assumed the throne and sent word that he would be visiting the capital to formalize his support for the reforms. The visit was a triumph. Young Alpha Gaston brought with him representatives from the northern forbidden bloodlines, wolves who had lived in hiding their entire lives and were now stepping into the light. The joint declaration he signed with Theodore and Emmeline became known as the Three Kingdoms Accord, a formal agreement to abolish all forbidden bloodline laws across their territories and work together to encourage other kingdoms to follow suit. "This is how it spreads," Emmeline said as she watched Gaston's procession leave the capital. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling their child kick. Not through war or force, but through example and alliance. Other alphas will see 3 kingdoms thriving under the new system and realize they can't maintain the old ways forever. 2 weeks later, Emmeline went into labor. It was late evening when the contractions started. Painful, regular, unstoppable. The healers were summoned immediately, and Theodore refused to leave her side despite traditional protocol that said fathers should wait elsewhere. "I didn't stand beside her through everything else just to abandon her now," he told the scandalized midwife. "I stay." The labor was long and difficult. Emmeline had survived sword wounds and assassination attempts, but bringing a new life into the world was its own kind of agony. She screamed, she cried, she cursed Theodore's name more than once, which he took with grace and encouragement, holding her hand even when she squeezed hard enough to leave bruises. "You can do this," he whispered during a brief respite between contractions. "You've done impossible things before. You'll do this impossible thing too." "This is different," she panted. "Before I was only risking myself. Now you're bringing our daughter into the world." He kissed her forehead. "Because you're going to survive this and so is she, and we're going to be a family." "I know it." "How do you know it's a girl?" "I don't. But I've been hoping." His smile was tender. "A daughter with your courage and your fire. What could be more perfect?" At dawn, after hours of labor that felt like years, Emmeline gave one final, desperate push and heard the sound she'd been waiting for. A baby's cry, loud and indignant and beautifully alive. The midwife lifted the infant, and Theodore's laugh was half sob as he announced, "A girl. We have a daughter." They named her Marguerite, after Emmeline's mother. Little Marguerite had Theodore's golden eyes and Emmeline's dark hair, and when the healers examined her thoroughly, they pronounced her perfectly healthy. No curse, no weakness, no corruption from her mixed bloodline. Just a beautiful, normal, squalling baby who would someday be queen. The kingdom celebrated for 3 days. Even some of the old families who had opposed the reforms sent congratulations, partly out of genuine joy, partly out of political necessity. Marguerite was the heir now, second in line after Bastien, and opposing her too openly would be seen as treason. Emmeline spent the weeks after Marguerite's birth in a haze of exhaustion and overwhelming love. She'd thought she understood devotion when she'd saved Bastien from the assassin, but this was different. This was her child, part of her and part of Theodore, the living embodiment of everything they'd fought for. When she nursed her daughter in the quiet hours before dawn, when she felt Marguerite's tiny hand grip her finger with surprising strength, she understood finally why parents did impossible things for their children. But motherhood didn't mean she could stop being queen. Work continued, albeit at a slower pace while she recovered. She held council meetings with Marguerite sleeping in a bassinet beside her chair, scandalizing the older members but establishing a new precedent. Queens could be mothers and leaders simultaneously. One afternoon, 3 months after Marguerite's birth, Councilwoman Genevieve requested a private audience. The older woman had become one of Emmeline's strongest allies on the council, but she looked troubled as she entered the Queen's chambers. "Your Majesty, I've received disturbing reports from the western provinces. Lord Matthias's preservation movement isn't as dormant as we thought. They've been recruiting in secret, building an actual militia. And their rhetoric has shifted from preserving tradition to actively resisting reform." She handed over several documents. "These were intercepted by our intelligence network. They're planning something big." Emmeline read through the documents, her blood running cold. The preservation movement had evolved into something more dangerous. An organized resistance group with weapons, training, and a plan to strike at the heart of the reforms by targeting the institutions Emmeline had created. Schools for forbidden bloodline children, integration programs, even the hospitals that now treated all wolves equally regardless of heritage. How many are involved? Hundreds, possibly thousands. They've been clever, keeping their true numbers hidden. Lord Matthias is providing funding and coordination, but he's insulated himself legally. We can't arrest him without concrete proof of illegal activity. Then we get proof. Emmeline's voice was steel. "Send our best investigators. Infiltrate if necessary. I want to know everything about this organization. Who leads it, where they meet, what they're planning, and when they plan to do it. And Genevieve, we do this quietly. If they realize we're onto them, they'll scatter and reform somewhere else." The investigation took 6 weeks and revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The preservation movement had contacts in the military, sympathizers on the council, and even a few servants within the palace itself. They were planning a coordinated strike on the first anniversary of Marguerite's birth, a symbolic gesture meant to show that the reforms would end where they began, with the death of the child who proved they could work. Emmeline felt sick when she read the final intelligence report. These weren't just political opponents anymore. These were terrorists willing to murder a baby to make their point. "We arrest everyone," Theodore said, his fury barely contained. "Tonight. Simultaneously. We don't give them time to realize we know." "That's 300 arrests across 5 provinces," General Mathieu pointed out. "It'll look like a purge. It might turn moderates against us, make martyrs of the conspirators. I don't care how it looks. They're planning to kill my daughter." "Our daughter," Emmeline corrected gently. She understood his rage, felt it herself, burning in her chest like wildfire, but she also understood the political implications. "But Matthew's right. We need to be strategic. We arrest the leaders and anyone directly involved in planning violence. The rest, the ordinary members who just attended rallies and meetings, we surveil but leave alone for now. We can't arrest people for their beliefs, only for their actions." It was a compromise nobody loved, but it was the right approach. That night, coordinated raids across the kingdom brought in 73 conspirators, including Lord Matthias himself. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Detailed plans, weapons caches, communications proving their intent. The trials were swift and public, ensuring transparency. Most received prison sentences. Lord Matthias and the core leadership group who had directly planned the attack on Marguerite were executed. And this time, Emmeline didn't protest. There were limits to mercy, and plotting to murder a baby crossed every one of them. The preservation movement collapsed after the arrests. Some members renounced their association, horrified when they learned how far the leadership had been willing to go. Others simply melted away, unwilling to continue without organized structure. Within months, active resistance to the reforms had diminished to scattered grumbling, frustrating but manageable. Years passed. Marguerite grew into a bright, fearless child who adored her older brother Bastien and had inherited both her parents' determination. The reforms continued spreading across the 5 kingdoms as other alphas saw the prosperity it brought. New generations grew up knowing forbidden bloodlines only as historical curiosities, not current reality. Emmeline stood in the throne room one afternoon, now 35 years old and bearing the confidence of a queen who had fought for her position rather than inherited it. She was hearing petitions from citizens, a tradition she'd instituted early in her reign. Anyone could request an audience with the queen to present grievances or proposals. The petitioner before her was a young woman, perhaps 20, with nervous eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Your Majesty, I wanted to thank you. My grandmother was from the Shadowfen line, same as you. She spent her whole life hiding it, terrified someone would discover her heritage and have her executed. But because of your reforms, I grew up never having to hide. I went to school openly. I got married last year to a man from an old alpha family, and nobody tried to stop us. My children will never know what it's like to live in fear." Tears streaked her face. "I just wanted you to know that. What you did, what you and King Theodore did, it gave people like me a future." Emmeline's own eyes burned. She descended from her throne and did something protocol said she shouldn't. She embraced the young woman. "Thank you for telling me. Days like this remind me why all the fighting and pain was worth it." That evening, she found Theodore in their private chambers, playing chess with Bastien while Marguerite helped in her own chaotic way. The scene was so perfectly domestic that Emmeline had to pause in the doorway, drinking it in. "You're staring," Theodore said without looking up from the chessboard. "I'm admiring. There's a difference." He glanced up then, and the smile he gave her was the same one that had first made her realize she was falling in love with him. Warm, genuine, unguarded. "Come join us. Bastien is destroying me, and I need reinforcements." "I am not destroying you," Bastien protested with a grin. "I'm winning because I'm better at chess." "Humility clearly isn't his strongest trait," Theodore said dryly. "He gets that from you," Emmeline replied, settling beside them as Marguerite immediately climbed into her lap. Later, after the children were asleep and they were alone in the darkness of their bedroom, Theodore pulled Emmeline close. "Do you ever regret it? Any of it?" "Which part?" "The sword wounds. The assassination attempts. The political nightmares. All of it. Everything we've been through to get here." Emmeline thought about her parents, executed for loving across forbidden boundaries. About 17 years as a servant, invisible and powerless. About the moment she'd thrown herself in front of a blade for a child who wasn't hers. About the impossible journey from the lowest position in the kingdom to its highest. "Not for a second," she said finally. "Every scar, every struggle, every impossible choice, it all led here. To you. To our children. To a kingdom where love matters more than bloodline. How could I regret that? Even though I signed your parents' death warrant. Even though I was the king who enforced the very laws that made your childhood hell." It was a question he'd asked in various forms over the years, as if he couldn't quite believe she'd forgiven him. And every time her answer was the same. You were doing what you thought was right under an unjust system. But when you saw a chance to change that system, you took it, even though it cost you politically, even though it put you in danger. You chose to be better. That's what matters. I chose you, he corrected. Everything else followed from that. We chose each other, Emmeline said. And we keep choosing each other every day. That's what makes this work. Years turned to decades. Emmeline and Theodore ruled together, weathering challenges and celebrating triumphs, growing old in partnership. Bastien eventually married, a woman he loved from a formerly forbidden bloodline, proving that the next generation had fully embraced the changes their parents fought for. Marguerite grew into a fierce advocate for justice, traveling the 5 kingdoms to ensure reforms were being implemented properly. On the 50th anniversary of the day Emmeline had saved Bastien from the assassin's blade, a memorial was unveiled in the palace gardens. It depicted a woman with a sword standing over a child, her body positioned to shield him from danger. The inscription read, "In honor of Queen Emmeline, who taught us that true nobility comes not from bloodline but from courage, not from tradition but from love, not from power but from the willingness to sacrifice for others." Emmeline, now 70 and silver-haired but still sharp-eyed and strong-spirited, stood with Theodore as they unveiled the memorial. He was 71, moving slower than he once had but still commanding respect wherever he went. They held hands as they looked at the statue, a frozen moment from the day that had changed everything. "Do you remember what you were thinking?" Theodore asked, "when you threw yourself in front of that blade?" "I wasn't thinking anything. I just knew I couldn't let him die." She squeezed his hand. "Do you remember what you thought when you saw me lying there?" "I thought I'd been wrong about everything. About pack law, about forbidden bloodlines, about what really mattered. And I thought that if you died, I'd never forgive myself for all the years I'd wasted enforcing unjust laws. But I didn't die. No, you lived. You fought. You changed the world." He turned to face her fully, and despite the lines on his face and the silver in his hair, his eyes held the same intensity they'd had that day in her sick room when he'd first offered his claim. "And you let me change with you. You let me be better than I was. That's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me." Emmeline smiled, rising on her toes to kiss him despite their age, despite the crowd watching, despite protocol. "We gave each other that gift. That's what mates do." The celebration continued around them. Music and dancing, children playing, wolves from every bloodline gathering together in harmony. It wasn't perfect. There were still prejudices, still those who longed for the old ways, still work to be done. But standing there in the garden, watching the kingdom they'd built together, Emmeline felt a profound sense of peace. She had taken sword blows to shield the Alpha King's heir. He had claimed the rejected Omega instantly. And together they had transformed not just their own lives but the entire kingdom. That was their legacy. That was their love story. And it was far from over.